Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Riju Banerjee, and I'm a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. On behalf of Institute of Chinese Studies, I extend a warm welcome to all to today's ICS Wednesday seminar titled China's Production Engine and the Emerging Limits of Global Absorption. This seminar examines the changing external environment confronting China's export-oriented growth model. For decades, state-directed industrial policy and deep integration into global production networks have given China an unmatched manufacturing scale. However, slowing global demand, geo-economic fragmentation, and a growing emphasis among major economies on strategic autonomy over efficiency are narrowing the international market's ability to absorb Chinese exports. The discussion will consider how this reconfigured international environment is placing new constraints on China's export-led model, with the country's central challenge increasingly lying in securing demand abroad rather than expanding capacity at home. It will also touch on how these shifts are altering patterns of global industrial competition and pushing economic priorities towards resilience and strategic autonomy. The speaker for today's session is Vivek Kelkar. He is a researcher, analyst, and a columnist working on issues of geoeconomics, geopolitics, and sustainability. He is also a visiting faculty at the ABV Indian Institute of Information Technology and Management. Having done his MA in International Political Economy from the University of Sheffield and an MBA from Ashridge Business School, his interests primarily lie in global power shifts, strategy, trade transitions, and the geopolitics of climate-related systemic risk, studying emerging trends across China, Southeast Asia, as well as West Asia. The chair for today's session is Dr. Bishwajit Thor. He is a development economist and a former professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning in Jawaharlal Nehru University. He previously served as Director General of the Research and Information System for Developing Countries and played a central role in setting up and leading the Center for WTO Studies. Professor Thor has served as a member of the Indian delegation in multilateral treaty negotiations and has also been nominated in expert groups for several intergovernmental organizations. He also writes regularly as a columnist and has served on the board of directors of the Exim Bank of India. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. I now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Dr. Thor. Thank you.
Thank you, Riju, and a very good afternoon to all of you, and especially to Mr. Vivek Kelkar. I just had an opportunity to speak with him before uh, a while back. This is an extremely interesting topic, and I think it wouldn't have been more timely that we're discussing this issue because China's excess capacity is in the focus. Of course, so it's India's. India has also been pulled up by the US. There is an investigation going on as we are speaking under the US Trade Act, Section 301 of the of US Trade Act, on China's excess capacity and the security threat that this is causing to the US. Of course, this is an issue that President Trump has been, has been talking about since his first term in office. That how the Chinese have been capturing the American economy and diminishing US's manufacturing capabilities. Now, in fact, if you look at this narrative coming from the US, you need to go back. This particular sentiment came out of Washington almost immediately after the global financial crisis in 2008, where when in the process of reviving the American economy, the U.S. had actually adopted an industrial policy, which it actually shunned for decades. Now, of course, they didn't call it industrial policy, but the whole objective was that they should get so they should decouple from China to the extent possible by strengthening their manufacturing sector. And of course, then the pressure was on China to reduce their excess capacities. The attack was on their export-led model, which we are going to hear from Vivek. And the advice, quote unquote, given to China was that this model, your export-led model, is passé. you got to now you got to your economy has to grow on the basis of internal demand, not external demand. And this was the push that came in the early 2010s, and then of course the rest is history. So as I said, that this is an extremely topical issue, and we would like to hear from Vivek as to what his analysis and prognosis is going forward. And as I said, that India has also been accused by the US. So whatever Vivek says about China, to an extent, it could also be applicable to India. So without any further ado, let me hand over the floor to Vivek. I think we make a 30-minute presentation or something of that kind. And then,
Yes, I'll
yeah.
try and stay within that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank
So
you.
you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Professor Dar, for your kind words and a wonderful intro, I must say. You actually summed up virtually my whole first slide, if I might say that. So China's is a very curious phenomena. It's creating a puzzle today, which is China has an unmatched manufacturing dominance. And today what we're facing is a geopolitically fragmenting global environment. This is a situation that we haven't seen for a very, very long time. Arguably, perhaps you could take it back to just before the First World War, but since then we haven't seen something like this. The core of the puzzle is that China is roughly 1/3 of global manufacturing output. You look at China's competitive positions, whether it's in advanced technologies or whether it's even in some of the more basic technologies, and then you look at specific products like electric vehicles, batteries, shipbuilding, robotics. China is ahead in all of those. And it has a dominant market shares across all of these. Now, the challenge here is that perhaps, in the decade that Professor Dhar mentioned, 2000 to 2010, the world might have absorbed such dominant manufacturing output. But today, when the global growth is slowing, we've seen shocks since COVID, we've seen shocks since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and now more recently with the war in the Middle East. So the question really is, while global growth has slowed down, while major economies adopt protective industrial policies, what is going to happen in the future? China's had 4 decades, arguably, of cumulative advantage. It's a highly successful industrial engine with state-directed industrial policy. It's had a distinct export-oriented industrialization. And the key factor is that there's deep global integration. This integration extends across intermediates. And in fact, some of the data shows, if you look at the RIVA data, that shows that China is at the core of virtually every intermediate production in the world. Virtually every intermediate goods or commodity produced in the world, and China is at the core of that. We have today, what's happened for China is that manufacturing scale has lowered unit costs. It's increased its competitiveness. It's enabled financial technological upgrading. And obviously, it's increased its market share. But this is a self-reinforcing cycle. And if something breaks in this cycle, which is really where we coming to the question of what's happening today, then we are in a very different position. So, and much of this has been arguably been happening since China's accession to the WTO in 2001, where the Western world invested in China, reorganized global value chains around Chinese factory ecosystems. And ecosystems really means that China's developed a cluster manufacturing system. It manufactures everything from, while it might import some commodities, it manufactures virtually all the intermediates down to the final goods. China's continues to expand factory capacity today across critical technology frontiers until about a year and a half, 2 years ago. You saw that with their fixed asset investment numbers. But today, global markets are no longer freely expanding to match China's growth. So where's the critical pivot over the previous 2 decades and this decade, over the last 25 years and this decade? It's no longer about China's physical capacity to produce. It's about whether the international trading order can continue to absorb it. Does it want to continue to absorb it? And let's look at what conditions are operating. It's both geopolitical fragmentation, geo-economic rivalry. The scale of its manufacturing systems is well known. It's more than 30% of global manufacturing goods. But the significant point, like Professor Dhar said, is about growing its domestic consumption. China absorbs only around 18% of global manufacturing demand, which is really the problem for the rest of the globe because the surplus is exported. China's factory output today exceeds that of the next 9 manufacturing economies combined. So there are 4 explanations or 4 discussions that normally happen around this. They note one is the domestic rebalancing discussion, which notes weak household consumption, China's aging demographics, the property downturn, and the high savings rate. The second one it derives a lot of debate in this regard has been coming from the EU and from the US, which talks about industrial overcapacity. It focuses on allocative inefficiencies within China, the high level of credit subsidies that it offers, and declining capital returns in sectors like solar and batteries. The other argument that comes up is geopolitical decoupling, because we see a clear trend towards tariffs, friendshoring, China plus one, export controls from both sides, from China and the West. We're looking at trade weaponization. However, none of these actually explore what is happening. Each explanation focuses on its own layer. They underexplore the complex interaction between these 3 forces. And all these 3 forces are intertwined. So what I'm proposing, and this is a mid-range kind of a framework, I emphasize a mid-range kind of a framework to analyze this, is what we need to look at is the ability of the global economy to safely accommodate the expanding product output of a dominant manufacturing state without triggering structural macroeconomic imbalances, national security threats, or trade order fragmentation. That's the way I'm defining systemic absorptive capacity. And then we'll come to how this is really working in the system today. The key pillars for this is economic, expanding global real incomes, fluid trade finance. We see the problems with sanctions. Sanctions don't help. Politically, this is dependent on the willingness of global nation states to accept asymmetric trade relationships and the massive production dependency that exists with China today, or with any other dominant manufacturing nation state that might come up in the future. Institutional, there's the questions around the WTO as an institution, which forms the basis of this. Is the global rules-based trading system continue to remain? Will it remain as open as it has in the past? The US has recently come out with its own views on that, which are not exactly encouraging. They even the US even decries the most favored nation system, which has been a dominant model for the WTO. And then we come down to the scope conditions for systemic absorptive capacity. When does this become a primary threat? It's when a dominant country builds immense productive capacity across multiple high value strategic industries simultaneously. And the primary examples of this is China. It dominates across a variety of segments from basic industries to some of the most advanced frontier technologies today. Its output is deeply integrated into global supply chains, and geopolitical competition aggressively dictates policy and macroeconomic choices. This is where the question of industrial policy comes in. This is where the question of rivalry, trade rivalry comes in. And where we are really looking at is the fourth point, where trading partners or other nation states, whether they're developed economies or advanced developing economies or the global south or whatever terminology you give it, each of them wants to prioritize national and economic security. And today, the argument is that national and economic security is intertwined. Every nation wants supply chain resilience. Firms at the base level, at the material level of the global economy, are calling for supply chain resilience. There are questions over tech autonomy and how tech autonomy might define power in the global system. And price efficiency remains a core, but the question being debated today is whether this level of autonomy actually leads to balance against basic price efficiency. And price efficiency has been the dominant model for the last 70, 80 years. The theoretical foundations are well known. We have Robert Gilpin, who defined distributions of economic capacity and how they reshape international orders. Susan Strange, whose work I personally admire very much, talks about how structural power is rooted directly in controlling the means and sites of production. Farrell and Newman, whose work in 2019 talked about trade weaponization and how interdependent networks turn into tools of strategic coercion or weaponization once supply chains are securitized. Albert Hirschman, incidentally, goes back to 1945. In his book in 1945, he talked about how economic security and national security are intertwined and how trade creates the deep asymmetric dependence that can create strategic vulnerabilities for nation states. And this has been echoed by David Baldwin back in 1978. Kenneth Arrow, the great economist, has talked about market uncertainty and how this uncertainty can disrupt efficient resource allocation, which is what we're really seeing. Because today, trade weaponization and questions over the geopolitical rivalry are creating a form of market uncertainty, and we're raising questions about efficient resource allocation. So if efficient resource allocation meant, for instance, the liberalized theories of economics that came up through Friedman and later in the 70s and the 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, Hayek and Friedman, are those really in place today, or are we even operating in, forget perfectly competitive markets, are we really operating in fairly competitive markets? So what we're seeing today is a recursive kind of paradox of industrial success. China's success has created its own structural boundaries. The more successful its state-backed production regime is, the higher the incentives for other nation states to erect trade defenses and build competing manufacturing systems. This extreme manufacturing efficiency that China has developed has triggered geo-economic counter-responses that systematically decrease the international system's willingness to export, to accept further trade exports from China. So we have a production versus intake mismatched in the global economy, as we said. China, as we said, manufactures just over 30% of global goods. It can't absorb all that. And if you look at the data from China's General Administration of Customs, just look at the data from 2015 to 2025, 10 years. It's more than doubled. The merchandise trade surplus has more than doubled. If it was $510 billion in 2015, at the end of 2025, it was 1.19 or 1.2 trillion. If you look at China from 2001 to 2008, and mind you, this is a great paper that Professor Athar referred to when he in his this thing. He was kind enough to send it to me earlier today. At that point in time, China's inbound trade was heavily concentrated in low margin, labor intensive sectors. But today, since 2018, and I'm not looking at this in terms of the common balance of China Shock 1.0 or China Shock 2.0. I'm just looking at it in terms of two eras. So if you look at 2018 to 2026, the shift has clearly been to capital intensive, high technology frontiers, electrical vehicles, lithium batteries, advanced machinery, frontier technology. And a lot of this has come from Xi Jinping's 2015-2025 plan. Then you look at what's been happening over the last few years, and you look at the export similarity index, which is where some of the discomfort in the West among the advanced economies with China comes in, the similarity between their export baskets. This China's export basket mirrors and directly competes with the high-end industrial output of advanced economies. This is where Germany is uncomfortable, for instance. This is where the EU is getting deeply uncomfortable. Having said that, the EU is in a trap, as we will just see, because it's intermediate goods. A large part of Germany's, if I remember the data correctly, roughly 16% of Germany's chemical intermediates, and chemicals is one of the biggest industries there is sectors for Germany. They come from China, which creates a serious form of vulnerability. So what we're looking at today is geo-economic fragmentation with a political constraint. The constraint is this dominance. The constraint is structural and political. Post 2008, initially you did have some open markets, but then after 2018, the US-China trade war, and as Professor Dar has pointed out, this goes back to even 2008 itself, after the 2008 crisis, when the US first started looking at industrial policy, perhaps not in that name, but it was industrial policy, and there were echoes of that nevertheless. And then you had the 2022 pandemic and the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. So these are vulnerabilities that have been exposed, concentrated single source supply networks, pushing nation states to question market efficiency and raise issues over what is economic security and how does economic security tie into national security. So what we are seeing today is a rise in defensive legislative walls. There is, over the last 5 or 6 years, every major economy has passed sweeping industrial laws. And now they're both trying to prevent imports of certain critical materials into those economies where there might be vulnerability. They're trying to promote industrial policy in their own way, and industrial policy spending is becoming a major driver for both advanced economies and developing economies. The IMF now actively tracks this visibly. They look at state industrial policies as a primary driver of the global economy, and they have recently warned that subsidy-led competition will fragment trade. We've looked at this. The quantitative pivot for this is that in the last 50 years, arguably, it's only China which has built internal manufacturing footprint of this relative scale. It's, the traditional export powerhouses in the mid 80s, like Japan during its peak friction era, or Germany, even in the 1980s, or at its industrial maturity in 2015. Their manufacturing surpluses were just between 4.0 and 4.5 of their national GDP. And if you look back at 1985 and you look at the Plaza Accord, which the US imposed on Germany and Japan, when Japan was about 4.5% or for just over 4%, 4.3%, at that point in time, the US was still a dominant economy and it could still impose policies like the Plaza Accord to curb a growing powerhouse. Today, the US is not in a position to do that. It cannot curb China, and we're looking at that with the series of meetings, whether it's been through the Biden era or the series of meetings that the Trump administration has had in Trump 2.0. It's not able to successfully curb China's growth. And it cannot today, it doesn't have the power today that it had in 1985 to impose something like the Plaza Accord. So what we are looking at is an era where China's manufacturing surplus is about 10.5% of national GDP. The only time this has happened previously in the last 80 years since the end of the Second World War is perhaps with the US in the late 1950s and through the 1960s when it was just over 10%, 10.5% in the early 1960s. But that was a completely different era. And today we're living in a completely different economic era. So today, some of the assumptions that are happening is that the global South will simply absorb some of these Chinese exports. They will be redirected from advanced economies to developing markets. But is that really happening? It's probably a more complex picture. Brazil is imposing anti-dumping measures on Chinese steel, chemicals, and some industrial goods. Turkey is raising tariffs on Chinese EVs. Mexico is looking at investment screening in some strategic manufacturing. Of course, some of this is under pressure from the United States, but nevertheless, this is happening. Mexico was being talked about as a connector economy, but that is under pressure from the US, more so with the USMCA being the Trump administration refusing to push that further. So India is looking at PLI, India is looking at Atmanirbharta, we're imposing investment restrictions. Some of those are being diluted very strategically, but then nevertheless, investment restrictions are there, especially on China. South Africa is doing much the same thing. It's going in for localization policies. And you look at even other countries within the ASEAN, which is a very critical region. Look at countries like Indonesia. Indonesia is now no longer willing to be a global or a nickel commodity supplier to China. It's looking at building its own nickel processing industry. It would rather not export the raw commodity to China anymore. There are worries coming up in Thailand. So this is becoming very complex. There are concerns over manufacturing dependence everywhere. And the politics of industrial resilience, industrial policy for resilience is now global. We moved from 2007 to 2024, where the data shows that inbound shipments from China across the world, whether you look at Africa, South America, Russia, or developing Asia, have moved from 20 to 40% plus of total imports. And we're looking at aggressive tariff barriers in the US. But the US is the single major economy that's showing a structural drop in its import share from China over the last 2 or 3 years, 3 or 4 years. It's come down to something like 12%. But having said that, a lot of this is because China is employing the connector economy strategy with great effect. But we're even seeing a pushback on the connector economy strategy. If you look at the EU, which is particularly in the news now, and there's a great deal of debate happening in China, both China and the EU are, they've got retaliatory policies. So the bilateral trade deficit has doubled from 150 billion in 2015 to 360 billion in 2025. The inbound shipments to Europe hit an all-time high in 2025. There's something wrong with this figure, I'm sorry. But the EU's exports to China dropped 6.5% down to 199 billion in 2026, 2025. Europe, which was a dominant high-value machinery exporter, hit a ceiling because Beijing's Made in 2025 strategy has been extraordinarily successful. They've got local technology frontier replacements in semiconductors, automation, robotics, precision engineering, and most of the engineering and high-value machinery categories. Europe is rolling out extensive anti-subsidy duties, especially on Chinese EVs, 17 to 25% on top of baseline 10% duties. They've enacted acts like the Foreign Subsidies Regulation, the Critical Raw Materials Act, and the Net Zero Industry Act. The US and its allies are doing much the same thing. Legislative pushes, the Biden era US Chips and Inflation Reductions Act. Japan has introduced its own Economic Security Promotion Act. All of these, in effect, prioritize state-funded decoupling. You look at ASEAN or the Global South, look at Thailand, bilateral deficits have reached a record 53.854 billion, 46 billion for Singapore, 20.5 billion for Indonesia. Chinese goods have gone into alternative markets. Late 2025, the imports into Southeast Asia spiked 30%, threatening to crowd out local factories. We have evidence of textile factories, for instance, closing in Thailand. We have evidence of other medium-scale industries threatened in Indonesia. And we've now seen how other countries in the Global South are aggressively introducing barriers. However, the interesting thing is this might well be an outcome of the kind of competition which is happening. Because in order to understand this competition, we have to recognize what happens if there is oversupply. If parallel manufacturing systems across some of these key products are set up globally, whether it's in the EU, whether it's in India, Japan, South Korea, the United States, or wherever, if parallel global capacities come up across some of these key technologies, across some of these frontier technologies, across some important intermediate goods like critical minerals, processing, what really happens? We get into a mode where, with a global economy which is currently growing at 3%, unlike, say, what happened in the first 10 years of this century, where it grew at about 3.7, 3.8%, you're looking at oversupply. The global economy can't absorb these goods effectively. And therefore, you are looking at a scenario where industrial policy drives inefficiency. Is that a risk going forward? It's a situation that's unfolding. We still don't have answers for that. A lot depends on how the global economy effectively grows over the next 3 to 5 years. But this is a threat going forward, and we're seeing evidence of this in India, in China. We're looking at collapsing capacity utilization. This is China's National Bureau of Statistics data, and capacity utilization is dropping steadily. 2024, 76.2%, 2025, 74%, and the data for June was 73%. This is the lowest recorded level since the height of the 2020 pandemic lockdown. Now, effectively, if you look at for industry to operate profitably, you look at a capacity utilization of say 80, 82, 85%. And if we're looking at 73% and we're looking at it going down further, if there are parallel manufacturing systems set up everywhere and the global economy not growing sufficiently, we have a problem. Will manufacturing eventually profitability also depends on economies of scale for a firm, and where that itself is going to be a challenge. The official China manufacturing purchasing managers index, it has fallen to 49.2 from 50.3 in June 2026. This was last one, July's data. And the 50-point threshold is important because this separates industry expansion from contraction. And it proves, if this persists, it proves that manufacturing within China has entered an active contractionary phase. So this is a deflationary cycle because prices are coming down. The wholesale China factory gate purchasing price index has entered into persistent deflation. It's fallen 2.6% over 2025. Look at some of the data for the auto sector and other sectors. Industry-wide profits in China have plunged 20% year on year in H1 2026, despite record volumes. So while you having the scale necessary, at the same time, you're not able to, because the absorptive capacity of the globe is falling, because you need to export more to retain that level of market share and to retain those volumes. You've got to cut down costs. You've got to cut down prices, and which is where you're seeing this industry-wide profit plunge within China. What this is doing is that industry capex is contracting within China. Whether it's mineral processing or chemicals, the data is all there. Non-governmental private industrial investment has contracted by 6.4% in 2025. And the IMF, you look at its recent Article 4 consultation on China, it has confirmed that state-led, debt-led debt finance investment has caused weakening productivity and structural excess supply in China. China is reacting to this. It has proposed the governance framework. It had a meeting, there were a series of meetings through July where they're talking about moving away from mere production cuts to enforcing structural price force. They're talking about weaponizing the national pricing law, outlawing irrational competition, making it illegal for factories to dump items below actual production costs. There are working capital squeezes that are happening. They're looking at strict carbon metrics for inefficient plants, a 60-day supplier payment rule to stop large firms from squeezing for suppliers and to fund price cuts, essentially to manage working capital better, eliminating export rebates. But this key thing that Professor Dhar pointed out in his opening remarks, domestic consumption within China remains a question. The question really that is being asked world over today is, are China's moves enough to grow their domestic consumption sufficiently? From the current evidence, they're not. So what might China's new strategic model be? We've seen some evidence of this over the last 3 or 4 years. We've seen them grow the connector economies strategy with Vietnam, Mexico being significant examples. So the pivot is from shipping just the end product, the physical goods, the final physical goods, to exporting entire production lines, still tied into China, but nevertheless, where the assembly or some key parts of the production line, the forward production lines, go into some of these economies. Some of the brands are being exported. You see that with BYD and some of the Chinese vehicle brands. And yes, there's some transfer of tech standards, but that is being retained as a core strength. The 15th five-year plan transitions economic industrial policy away from hardware assembly to focus on deep upstream capital tools, biomanufacturing, AI hardware, and essentially research-based technology products. And you look at foreign direct investment, you have some examples here, CATL's 7.3 battery footprint, the investment that it's making in Hungary, BYD in Hungary, 4 billion localized EV plant, BYD in Brazil and Mexico and Thailand. There's a nearly $2 billion localized assembly hubs there. The BYD hub in Mexico is going to cater to a large part of Latin America. At least that's a goal. We're looking at even battery infrastructure in Morocco. However, having put out this strategy, the question is, will there be a retaliation to the strategy from the advanced economies and from some of the growing economies like India? There is evidence that the EU is already talking about retaliation. The EU doesn't want some of this to come in. The EU is talking about an $800 billion investment by itself. That's been discussed, and some of it has commenced over the last 18, 20 months. The US is talking about this from a national defense viewpoint. So is the EU, where they're talking about technologies, whether it's the batteries or the EVs, as whether those can be weaponized in the future. The argument has even appeared in the media whether some of these, the battery infrastructure can just be shut down by China arbitrarily. Whether that effectively will happen in practice is something that's an open question. But these are debates that are being reflected in the media largely because they're being argued even in official circles. So where are we today? We're finding that these are recursive dynamics, and we have 5 points here which are essentially recursive, and they are creating the geo-economic, geopolitical frictions that are coming up today. You have the paradox of competitiveness. You look at it from China's continuous successful industrial expansion, which drives down unit costs and sharpens global market competitiveness, which is what China has done. This makes the world deeply reliant on Chinese factory ecosystems, which creates a vulnerability trigger, which heightens anxieties over strategic national vulnerabilities arising from concentrated dependence. So what happens is there is a kind of a defensive pivot where nation states actively counter this dependence by implementing their own aggressive industrial policies, They develop sweeping export controls and import controls, tariffs, and they have their own supply chain diversification mandates. You see some of these diversification mandates coming up even in the trade agreements that are coming up. If you look at some of the free trade agreements that are coming up, whether it's the EU-India free trade agreement or whether it's in the EU-Mercosur free trade agreement, the Mercosur being the Latin American trading bloc, all these are supply chain diversification mechanisms. All these are forms of developing defenses against concentrated dependence from China. So we see these occurring, and you see these occurring both within the WTO formats and utilizing some of the most trade MFN formats to build these forms of diversification, trade diversification. You see the kind of FTAs that the EU is negotiating with some of the ASEAN countries, and you see that, and you also see that in agreements like RCEP, or you see that in the CPTPP, which are creating their own pressures for some of the ASEAN economies. And you find that most of these trade agreements which are occurring remain largely within the WTO system, but they're almost developing as parallel minilaterals, if you can call them, or plurilaterals. This is actually a paper that Professor Venkatraman from IIM Indore and I are exploring, and we're going to be looking at publishing it soon. So what this is driving is a network shift where these defense measures restrict open market access, while China might look at internationalizing production, as we've just seen, or with regional assembly hubs in Vietnam or wherever. Yes, they do face internal financial pressures as well, because China's got to finance these, and with lower profitability margins arising from some of their firms, these firms will depend on state-directed investment to finance some of this growth. And this becomes if this is the new global blueprint, they don't necessarily restore the old open trade system that we envisaged in 2001, but we are going towards an era where we're looking at highly fragmented production networks, perhaps around geopolitical lines, rather than pure market efficiency, which was the goal which was there in 2001. And that goal is somehow now subsumed by national and economic security considerations. So we come back to the central argument, which is a systemic crisis of absorption. So China's ultimate structural barrier in the future is no longer its physical ability to sustain its domestic factory output. It is about the growing challenge of securing external global demand under conditions of strategic competition, geopolitical rivalry, geo-economic competition, national and economic security considerations. So this goes beyond pure economics. It's not a standard domestic demand deficit or a question of supply or industrial overcapacity. This is a deeper political economy problem. It's a friction that's emerging from the intersection of production, absorption, power, and state security. And this has a recursive trajectory. It is a cycle. Industrial success directly generates the defensive political counter responses that progressively choke off future market expansion, which creates a vicious cycle among nation states. This is a danger that the nation states need to look out for, which the globe needs to look out for. And this has indirectly been communicated by the IMF and some of its statements recently. So if we go back to the core definition of systemic absorptive capacity, It measures the global economic ability to safely accommodate a nation state's expanding industrial output without triggering chronic macroeconomic imbalances, security risks, or institutional fragmentation. This is something that I'm going to develop as a paper. This is a very, very preliminary look at what I intend to develop as a paper over the coming month or two, and which is why I'm presenting it today. And I'm hoping that I will get some critiques which will help me strengthen this paper greatly. So we're looking at a great realignment, security, national autonomy, supply chain insulation, changing decades-old paradigms of raw economic efficiency as the primary driver of global growth or global trade growth. And as China, the world's largest manufacturing powerhouse, faces a world that is increasingly unable or unwilling to absorb its expanding capacity, the global economy is entering into uncharted structural territory. It's a transformation whose financial outcome is far from written. We can have a lot of theories as to what scenarios as to what that final outcome may still be, but this is still unfolding. Thank you. That brings me to the end of the presentation, and I must thank the ICS and particularly Dr. Alka Acharya for giving me the opportunity to present to you.
Thank you, Mr. Kelkar. And this was absolutely fascinating presentation, and you took us through the entire, sort of the trajectories from the 80s, how things were had developed then, and how the US could manage the global economy then, and where it has actually is ending up now, where it seems to be pretty powerless, if I use a strong word, to do much. And this I'm saying for two reasons, and just to compare what you said about the 80s. You remember the US had actually imposed what it called voluntary export restrictions on Japan. And that was a very important tool that they used to prevent Japanese from continuing to exploit the American market. Today, the US can't do that. US actually, sort of the global, sort of relations, the political economy has gone in such a direction that such a kind of a framework, a VR kind of a thing, is just unthinkable. So what does Trump do? He just imposes tariffs left, right, and center, and trying to prevent the Chinese from over exploiting its market. The very, very recent paper from the Institute of International Economics, which shows that the Trump tariffs have done little to change the pattern and the volume of U.S. imports from China, which is we are all seeing it. The other thing which is very Sorry?
Yes, I've read that paper.
Yeah. So, and the other thing that is happening, simultaneously, and this is where one has to wait and watch and see how the Chinese actually, negotiate, is that China is actually reduced its dependence on the US to such an extent that the Trump tariffs, after a point, may not actually matter much. Remember when Trump started his aggressive intent against China, almost 20% or more than 20% of Chinese exports used to go to the US. Today, it's down to 10%. Yeah, and they're continuously shifting.
Yes.
And of course, they're finding newer markets. India being one of them, where our imports from China are just going through the roof. And many countries like India have recognized that, or realized, I won't say recognized, realized that raving and ranting against Chinese imports is not going to do anything. our whatever industrial system we have, industries we have, manufacturing we have, is so dependent on China that if you stop importing from the critical intermediates from China, for instance, the pharmaceutical APIs, the pharmacy of the world is going to just stutter and get phased out. So that's the situation that China has left us in. It's again extremely interesting thing to look at. And what you said, I'll just going to finish on that. There were a number of things I had to say about it. And of course, China exploited the global sentiment so perfectly. It came onto the stage when globalization was being thumbed down by Washington. And at the height of Washington consensus, it came onto the scene, exploited what the globalization scene to the fullest. And now, when there is deglobalization, is trying to evolve, having own policies, and one of them, what you mentioned, was really doing this investment, investing in other countries, shipping out production lines, and you would know that last year, Chinese outward FDI was the highest ever. Yeah.
Yes, it
Yeah,
was.
yeah. So this is a new phase that we are seeing, and in India also we are seeing some of the ramifications of that. We had imposed restrictions on Chinese imports, or sorry, investments after 2020. Now we're gradually, sort of loosening all those restrictions, and I think India also in the Indian government is also interested in attracting Chinese investments. So we are entering into a very different kind of a phase where exports are being replaced by this shift of capacity, production capacity by China into different countries. And this is what we need to see how it actually takes place. So I won't take any more time. So there are a lot of questions I can see on the chat in the chat box, and of course there'll be more questions, I'm sure. So let me request Riju to sort of read out the questions and then hear from Mr. Kelkar.
All right. We begin the interactive session. The first question is from Yash Pandey from Shuats. The question is a bit long, so I've reframed it to be shorter. The question is basically about workforce participation and demographics. China is often seen as maintaining relatively high productivity even among older adults beyond the formal retirement age. What lessons, if any, can India learn from this? Given India's social diversity, occupational traditions, and persistent stereotypes around certain kinds of work due to caste, how can greater workforce participation be encouraged across all age groups? And how can a large young population be equipped with the skills needed for productive employment?
This is a mammoth question. I'm not going to get into some of these areas, that he's put into his question. The thing to look at today is not just the age factor or any kind of a democratic dividend or any kind of a democratic, a demographic dividend or a demographic disadvantage. The question today is to look at what is emerging in terms of technology. We are looking at a future driven by AI. We are looking at a future driven by robotics and automation. That is inevitable. If you look at it from a firm point of view, whether it's robotics and automation, or whether it's any other form of technology, you're looking at a situation where your initial capital cost might be high, but you're saving a whole lot on variable costs going down the road. So what's the temptation, the level of temptation that industries or firms have to not do this? Firms are going to do this, whether this is India or China. China's already doing this. We're seeing some of this happening in the EU. We're seeing some of this happening in Germany as well. And it's inevitable that it's going to happen in India. So the question of skilling for India is being debated widely everywhere. So I'm not going to add to that clutter. But yes, there is a skilling task going forward. There is a task about managing for the future going forward when we look at the level of technology appropriation that's going to happen at the firm level over the next 3, 5, 7 years. So these are major, major challenges. We can't move away from them at all. So this is a very different question, and it's a challenge going forward.
All right, thank you. The next question comes from Santosh Pai. He thanks you for your excellent presentation and mentions that he's been a keen reader of your writings and also says, on July 28th, China State Council released a paper titled China's Position on So-Called Excess Capacity Issue. What are your views on this paper from an Indian perspective? And what are some outcomes India can pursue if there is a resumption of India-China strategic economic dialogue?
I've read the paper, China's position on the so-called excess capacity issue. If you read through it, it's a largely defensive argument. It is a narrative argument which is being made against some of the narratives that are coming out from, particularly from the EU, which has been vocal about this overcapacity issue. You look at some of the discussions that have happened, whether it's Germany, whether it's Chancellor Mertz's pronouncements, or whether it's France, or some of the pronouncements coming out from Brussels, from the EU itself, and some of the debates and the talks that have happened between China, whether it's Wang Yi's recent visit to the EU. These arguments have been discussed ad nauseum. At the moment, that paper looks like a defensive posture. It doesn't address what China needs to do to grow its own domestic consumption. It's not addressing that quite as sharply as the world would like to see. The point about the US in the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s was that while it was the world's dominant manufacturer, it was also the world's dominant consumer, which is something that China is not, and which is where this question of excess capacity comes in, because it's primarily driven. The manufacturing surplus is not being consumed internally, but it's being consumed externally through exports. And that is where the question comes up. So that, you look at that paper that Mr. Pai talked about, and there's still questions that can be raised over that paper. From an Indian perspective, if there is a resumption, if there is an active resumption of India-China strategic economic dialogue, as he puts it, as Professor Dhar pointed out, yes, we are gradually looking at easing some Chinese FDI into India. You look at some of the imports that are actually happening in some of the new technologies, whether it's batteries or some of these other technologies, you find that the bulk of these imports or the bulk of these technologies, some of these gigawatt battery farms that have been set up, they are happening from China, because that is the cheapest point that you can acquire them from. And in the interest of cost efficiency, you have to, at your firm level cost efficiency, you have to go to China. There's very little alternative. So there will be some strategic economic dialogue that will happen and will continue to happen and perhaps grow in the future. But I think India is going to be very, very conscious about both the level of strategic autonomy that it needs to maintain. And as we've heard from the government repeatedly, they don't want a level of dependency that actually threatens national or economic security, which is an articulated position from the government. And so we'll have to we'll have to do a fine balancing act as time goes by. Go on, sir.
All right. The next question is from Dr. Mananjan Mohanty. He asks, how is the new production adjustment strategy tackling its effects on employment and regional disparities?
That's an open question. I mean, we still have to see how that's going to go on. Whether it is tackling the effects today, it's still open, because I don't think the effects have been very, very apparent on either employment or regional disparities in China itself. It's a longer term question.
Okay. The next question is from Ravi Bhutlingam. He says, would not a policy of encouraging Chinese investment into India with suitable security safeguards promote employment in India as well as reduce the trade deficit through the investment inflow? Moreover, this could lead to technology transfer over time, as happened in China's own case earlier in its growth trajectory.
I certainly agree with Mr. Bhutilingam. If Chinese investment in India with suitable security safeguards grows, it will grow manufacturing. And if it grows manufacturing, it will promote employment. And if India evolves into a connector economy like Vietnam, yes, it would reduce the trade deficit. Having said that, the question really that is being debated is, the whole question of suitable security safeguards, because questions are being raised about what a suitable security safeguard actually means. So whether it's at the technology level or whether it's in terms of other dependencies, core basic product intermediate level defense dependencies, is that an accurate, safe, suitable security safeguard? Are the questions that are being raised in the Western media about the vulnerability of battery technologies and electronic systems from a technology perspective, do they constitute, is there a possibility of suitable security safeguards there? So these are questions that will evolve with time. But yes, if we do get more Chinese investment into India, we can evolve into an economy that is pushing out. But then this again has to be balanced against, some of the pushback that is coming up against connector economies from, say, the US. So there's a lot of balancing factors that you have to look at here. Will this lead to technology transfer over time, as it happened in China's own case? That depends on China itself. Whether China is willing to transfer some level of advanced technologies remains an open question. China is building some of its own frontier technologies, and whether they will transfer some early stage technologies or some of the later stage technologies remains a question. But yes, if this technology transfer happens, it is to India's or any emerging markets or developing economies' advantage. And yes, it could lead to greater manufacturing, and it could help reduce the trade deficit over time. Mr. Bhutlingam is right there, but then there's questions that we need to balance too.
All right, there's no more questions in the chat box.
Are there others who would like to ask a question of Mr. Kelkar? Any burning question? Okay, I don't hear anyone. So it's my pleasure to thank Mr. Kelkar for this excellent presentation. He told us that he's going to be converting this into a paper, It'll be good that if you could share your presentation with some of us. We'll just have a look and then maybe give you feedback later. That'll be wonderful. But once your paper is out, we'll all look forward to reading it and learning more about how the global political economy is developing on this important issue. So let me now hand over to Riju to do the final honors. Thank you.
Riju, may I just step in for a minute?
Yeah, sure, sir.
Yeah, I just want to thank Professor Dhar for both his excellent opening remarks and for the excellent summing up that he did. And again, thank the Institute of Chinese Studies and Dr. Alka Acharya and all the participants, and particularly those who asked me those questions. Thank you for those excellent questions. It's been a real pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Speaker. With this, we come to the end of today's seminar. We thank Vivek Kelkar and Dr. Dhar for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also thank the audience for joining us today. We'd like to invite you to the upcoming Wednesday seminar. Further information regarding the event can be found on the ICS website, and you may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you for joining us today.